In the peaceful suburbs of Portland, Oregon, the Martin family seemed to have it all. A lovely home, thriving careers, and a family dynamic that neighbors admired. Rachel Martin, a 38-year-old interior designer, had rebuilt her life after a challenging divorce, marrying David Martin, a charismatic businessman, 3 years earlier. Together, they were raising Rachel's teenage daughter, Jessica, from her first marriage. To the outside world, they were the ideal family, but behind closed doors, cracks were starting to form, and a dark secret loomed, threatening to unravel everything they had built. On a cool spring evening, the Martins hosted a small dinner to celebrate Rachel and David's wedding anniversary. Extended family gathered around the table, toasting the couple's love, as laughter and the clink of silverware filled the room. Yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. Jessica, Rachel's 16-year-old daughter, sat quietly at the end of the table, her eyes shifting nervously between her mother and stepfather. Something was brewing, though no one could have predicted the storm that was about to break. Midway through the dinner, Jessica dropped a bombshell that left the room in stunned silence. With trembling hands and a voice thick with emotion, she revealed that she and David had been having an affair for over a year. "We're in love," she declared, her words slicing through the festive atmosphere like a knife. The room descended into chaos. Rachel, blindsided by the revelation, demanded answers. David, visibly shaken, denied the accusations, but faltered under the pressure as Jessica's confidence grew. What followed was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Rachel's perfect world crumbled in an instant, leaving her questioning everything she thought she knew about her husband and daughter. What had started as a celebration would spiral further out of control. By the end of the night, one person would be dead, another arrested, and a seemingly ordinary family would be thrust into a chilling true crime case. But what really happened in the Martin household that night? Was it a case of self-defense, as Rachel claimed, or an act of rage driven by jealousy and betrayal? As investigators pieced together the events leading up to the tragedy, they uncovered a tangled web of manipulation, obsession, and deceit that transformed this suburban family's life into a cautionary tale. This is the story of Jessica Martin, a teenager ensnared in a dangerous relationship, her mother Rachel, a woman pushed to her breaking point, and David Martin, a man whose charm hid a dark and destructive side. What should have been a family dinner to celebrate love instead became a battleground, leaving scars that would take years to heal. Rachel Martin had always been a fighter. After her divorce from her high school sweetheart, she worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. At 38, she had carved out a successful career as an interior designer, specializing in transforming outdated homes into stylish sanctuaries. Her work earned her respect, and she was proud of the life she had built for herself and her teenage daughter, Jessica. Living in the charming suburbs of Portland, Oregon, Rachel felt she had finally found her footing when she met David Martin, a charismatic businessman with an easy smile and confident demeanor. It seemed like the final piece of her puzzle had fallen into place. David was everything Rachel thought she wanted. At 42, he exuded stability and charm, owning a successful landscaping business and making everyone around him feel seen and appreciated. After a whirlwind romance, Rachel and David married and moved into a spacious home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. The Martins quickly became the ideal family, hosting backyard barbecues and participating in community events. Their neighbors often remarked on how happy they seemed, a blended family that had truly figured things out. But beneath the surface, things weren't as harmonious as they appeared. Jessica, Rachel's 16-year-old daughter from her first marriage, struggled to adapt to the new family dynamic. A bright but rebellious teenager, Jessica was used to being the center of her mother's attention. The arrival of David in their lives disrupted that balance, and Jessica often felt like an outsider in her own home. Her relationship with Rachel grew strained with frequent arguments about curfews, grades, and Jessica's growing independence. Jessica also struggled with the lingering pain of her father's absence. After Rachel's divorce, Jessica's biological father gradually faded from her life, making only sporadic attempts to reconnect. This abandonment left a void that Jessica desperately tried to fill. When David came into the picture, Jessica initially resented him, seeing him as an intruder. But over time, her feelings shifted. David had a way of making Jessica feel special. He complimented her, asked about her day, and treated her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Jessica began to view him not only as her stepfather, but as someone she could confide in. A person who seemed to genuinely care about her. Rachel, busy balancing her demanding career and new marriage, didn't notice the subtle changes in Jessica and David's relationship. At first, she was simply grateful that they seemed to be getting along, especially after their rocky start. When David offered to help Jessica with her homework or took her on drives to clear her head after an argument, Rachel thought nothing of it. She assumed David was merely trying to bond with her daughter and appreciated his efforts. But for Jessica, those moments with David meant much more. David, meanwhile, knew exactly what he was doing. Beneath his charming exterior was a man who thrived on control and manipulation. He recognized Jessica's vulnerability and used it to his advantage, encouraging her feelings without ever crossing a clear line. At least, not at first. To Jessica, his subtle gestures, a lingering glance, a playful comment, felt like declarations of love. To David, they were a way to feed his ego and feel powerful and desired. As the months went by, their dynamic became more inappropriate. David began spending more time alone with Jessica, taking her on errands or helping with projects that didn't require his involvement. Rachel noticed but dismissed it, assuming David was just being a good stepfather. After all, wasn't that what she had always wanted? A man who treated her daughter with kindness and care? Jessica, however, grew more emboldened. She started skipping school, claiming she was sick just so she could be home when David was around. She wrote in her journal about her love for him, fantasizing about a future where it was just the two of them. One day, she wrote in one entry, "We won't have to hide anymore. He'll see that I'm the one who truly makes him happy." Meanwhile, Rachel remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in her own home. She was preoccupied with work and planning their wedding anniversary, thinking her biggest challenge was handling the occasional argument with Jessica. She had no idea that the man she trusted most, and the daughter she loved more than anything, were hiding a secret that would eventually destroy their family. The Martin family's seemingly perfect suburban life was like a house of cards, carefully arranged, yet already beginning to wobble. Jessica's growing obsession, David's moral corruption, and Rachel's blindness to the signs set the stage for a tragedy no one could have anticipated. In their quiet Portland home, the ideal family was anything but, and the cracks that had begun to form were about to break wide open. Jessica Martin had always been a headstrong and deeply emotional teenager, but her infatuation with David Martin changed everything. At first, she saw him as a father figure, a stabilizing presence in her life. He was kind, attentive, and everything her biological father had failed to be. But over time, those feelings morphed into something darker, something Jessica mistook for love. It started innocently enough. David's compliments, always laced with charm, made her feel special in ways she hadn't before. "That dress looks great on you," he'd say with a smile, or, "You're too smart to let anyone put you down." To a vulnerable teenager craving attention, his words felt like lifelines. Jessica began hanging on his every gesture, replaying his compliments in her mind as she lay awake at night, gradually changing her style, gravitating toward clothing she believed might attract his attention. It began subtly but soon became more pronounced. She started wearing makeup her mother would never approve of, spending hours in front of the mirror perfecting her appearance for David. This attention intoxicated him. Jessica's admiration inflated his ego, and he relished the control he had over her. Though he never overtly initiated anything, his subtle flirtations, a prolonged gaze or a hand resting too long on her shoulder, blurred the lines of what was acceptable. He was fully aware that he was crossing a line, but the excitement of it outweighed any guilt. For him, it wasn't about love. It was about power. For Jessica, though, it was everything. She began to idealize their interactions, believing them to be signs of a love that was meant to be. She filled page after page in her journal with fantasies about their future together, writing, "Someday it'll just be us," and underlining the words with exaggerated loops. "He's only with her because he has to be. He belongs with me," she wrote, her obsession intensifying with each passing day. Jessica began to make up excuses to spend time with David. She waited for him to come home from work, pretending she had a problem with her homework so that he would sit with her at the kitchen table. She even volunteered to help with yard work, pretending to have an interest she had never shown before. Rachel, absorbed in her demanding job, was happy that Jessica and David seemed to get along so well. "It's nice that you're spending time with him," she told Jessica one evening, unaware of the deeper truth. But Jessica's feelings for David began to distort her perception of Rachel. She grew resentful, seeing her mother as an obstacle to the relationship she believed she had with David. In Jessica's mind, Rachel didn't deserve him. She convinced herself that David stayed with Rachel out of obligation, and Jessica fantasized about the day he would finally choose her instead. For her, it wasn't a matter of if, but when. As Jessica's obsession deepened, so did her defiance. She began skipping school, claiming to feel unwell, just to be home alone when David returned early from work. She refused to follow Rachel's rules, pushing boundaries wherever she could. Rachel attributed it to typical teenage rebellion, but the truth was far more sinister. Jessica wasn't just acting out, she was claiming what she believed was hers, determined to eliminate anything standing in her way. Meanwhile, David was content to let things develop, enjoying Jessica's attention but being careful not to let it go too far. At least not yet. He justified his actions, telling himself he wasn't doing anything wrong, even as he subtly encouraged her behavior. When Jessica skipped school, he didn't reprimand her. When she flirted, he didn't shut it down. His silence was complicity, allowing Jessica's obsession to grow unchecked. However, cracks in their secret began to show. Jessica's behavior became more erratic, and Rachel began noticing the subtle changes in her daughter. She dismissed it as typical growing pains, never imagining the storm quietly brewing in her home. Rachel, always a dedicated mother despite her demanding job, couldn't ignore the changes in Jessica's behavior. Her once bright, driven daughter had become distant and defiant seemingly overnight. Jessica's grades slipped, her school attendance became irregular, and at home, she became confrontational. She slammed doors, rolled her eyes, and dismissed Rachel's concerns with a sharpness that left Rachel confused. It was as if Jessica was hiding something, a secret Rachel couldn't quite put her finger on. The first real sign of trouble came one afternoon when Rachel was tidying Jessica's room. Among the clutter of textbooks and makeup on her desk, she found a notebook, open to a page filled with Jessica's looping handwriting. Rachel's heart sank as she read the words. "I wish it was just me and him. She doesn't deserve him. He's only with her because he feels stuck. One day, everything will be the way it's supposed to be." The pronouns were vague, but the message was clear. Jessica had fixated on someone. Initially, Rachel thought it was just a harmless teenage crush on a teacher or an older boy at school, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She pushed the worry aside, thinking it wasn't worth overreacting. But deep down, something told her the situation was more serious. Her unease grew as she noticed how much time Jessica was spending with David. At first, Rachel thought it was sweet that her husband and daughter were bonding, but over time, it began to feel excessive. Jessica would sit too close to David on the couch, laughing a little too hard at his jokes. She constantly sought his attention, finding reasons to be near him, even when Rachel was present. David didn't seem to mind. In fact, he encouraged it. He'd pat Jessica on the shoulder or ruffle her hair affectionately. Gestures Rachel initially thought were harmless. But there were the little things Rachel couldn't ignore. Like the time she walked into the kitchen and found Jessica standing next to David, whispering something that made him smile. When they noticed Rachel, they quickly broke apart, their expressions overly neutral. There was also the way Jessica seemed to glow whenever David complimented her, as though his approval meant more to her than anyone else's. One evening, after Jessica had gone to bed, Rachel decided to confront David. She casually brought it up, asking if he had noticed anything strange about Jessica. David raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What do you mean?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, saying, "She's been acting differently. I feel like she's been a little too attached to you lately." David laughed it off, dismissing her concerns. "She's a teenager, Rachel. She's probably just trying to figure herself out. It's not a big deal." But Rachel wasn't convinced. She carefully mentioned that she had found a note in Jessica's room, something that seemed to suggest a crush on someone. David's expression didn't change, but Rachel thought she saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. "You're overthinking it," he said smoothly. "Jessica's always been dramatic. I'm sure it's nothing." Rachel wanted to believe him, but the unease didn't go away. His dismissive tone left her feeling uneasy, and for the first time in their marriage, she began questioning his honesty. Yet, she pushed the thought aside, convincing herself she was being paranoid. If only Rachel had trusted her instincts. The secret within her home was darker than she could have ever imagined, and it was only a matter of time before it would destroy their family in ways no one could have predicted. The evening of Rachel and David's anniversary dinner arrived, marked by the same familiar routine as any other family gathering. The house was spotless, the dining table set with Rachel's best china, and the air was filled with the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary. Extended family and close friends arrived, congratulating Rachel and David on their milestone. For everyone else, it was a celebration of love and partnership. But for Jessica, it was an opportunity. She had spent all day rehearsing what she was about to do, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety, her stomach twisting in knots. This was her moment, the moment she would expose the truth and force David to choose her over Rachel. In her mind, the family dinner wasn't just a celebration, it was her stage. Rachel, unaware of the turmoil inside her daughter, greeted the guests with her usual warmth, moving between rooms to make sure everyone had a drink, chatting about work, vacations, and the little things that made suburban life feel perfect. David, ever the charmer, entertained the guests with stories and jokes that had everyone laughing. But Jessica watched him intently, her eyes narrowing as she saw him kiss Rachel on the cheek during a toast. Fake, she thought bitterly. All of it's fake. As everyone settled around the table, the atmosphere was cheerful. Glasses clinked, and laughter filled the room. Rachel stood to make a toast, thanking everyone for coming and expressing her gratitude for her marriage to David. "It's been an incredible 3 years," she said with a smile. "I feel so fortunate to have a partner who supports me and brings laughter into my life every day." Jessica's grip tightened on her fork as Rachel's words echoed in her mind. She couldn't take it any longer. Her heart raced as she scanned the table, her eyes finally fixing on David. "That's not true," she blurted out, her voice cutting through the laughter like a sharp blade. The room grew silent, all eyes shifting to Jessica, who stood with a flushed face and trembling hands. "David isn't the person you think he is," she declared, her voice becoming more confident. "He's been deceiving all of you, and he's been lying to her." "Jessica, what are you talking about?" Rachel asked, confusion and concern filling her expression. Jessica inhaled deeply, locking eyes with David. "David and we're in love. We've been seeing each other for over a year." The room erupted into chaos, gasps and murmurs filling the air, while Rachel's face twisted in disbelief. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Jessica's confidence grew as she watched the shock spread across everyone's faces. "It's true," she said boldly. "He loves me. He's only with you because he feels trapped. He's been waiting for the right time to leave you, but he's too scared to admit it." David's face drained of color. "Jessica, stop," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie." Jessica shot back. "You told me we'd be together. You said you didn't love her anymore." Rachel stood up suddenly, the sound of her chair scraping against the floor. "Jessica, this is insane. You're making all of this up." "I'm not!" Jessica shouted, tears streaming down her face. Ask him if it's true." All eyes turned to David, who hesitated, struggling to find words. I don't know what she's talking about," he said weakly. But his uncertain tone betrayed him. The guests whispered among themselves, the tension in the air palpable. Rachel's voice cracked as she spoke. "David, look at me. Tell me this isn't true." David hesitated for a moment too long, and that was all Rachel needed. She let out a choked sob, backing away from the table, her hands shaking. "How could you?" she whispered. Emboldened by David's silence, Jessica smirked triumphantly, believing she had won. She thought her confession would force David to finally choose her. But instead of siding with her, David turned to Rachel. "It's not what it seems," he said quickly. "I can explain." The betrayal hit Jessica like a slap. "You told me you loved me!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "You said we'd be together." David tried to calm her, but the damage was done. The family dinner, meant to celebrate love and unity, had descended into chaos. Guests hurried to leave, unwilling to stay in the middle of the turmoil. By the time the house emptied, only Rachel, David, and Jessica remained, and the confrontation was far from over. "Let's take a quick break to chat," the voice of the story's narrator offered. "What are your thoughts on the case we're diving into today? If you're enjoying the story, leave a 1 in the comments. If it didn't resonate, drop a 0. I'd love to hear your insights, so share them below. Thanks for sticking around. Your support means the world and helps me bring you new content every day. After the guests left, the tension in the Martin household reached a breaking point. Rachel stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, while David followed, desperate to explain himself. Jessica hovered just outside the room, her heart pounding as she listened. Rachel's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "How long, David? How long has this been going on?" "It's not what you think," David said, his tone defensive. "She's just a kid. She's confused." Jessica's face burned as she heard him dismiss her. Confused. How could he belittle her like that after everything they'd shared? She pressed her ear to the door, listening as Rachel continued to scold him. "Don't lie to me," Rachel snapped. "She stood in front of our entire family and told them you've been having an affair. How could you let this happen?" David sighed heavily. "Look, I made a mistake, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far." Jessica couldn't take it anymore. She burst into the room, her face red with fury. "You promised me," she shouted. "You said you'd leave her for me." Rachel turned to her, a mixture of shock and rage on her face. "Jessica, get out of here. This is between me and David." "No, it's not," Jessica shot back. "He's been lying to both of us, don't you see? He doesn't love you. He loves me." Rachel put her hand to her mouth, trying to stifle a scream. "You're delusional," she said, her voice trembling. "You're just a child, and he's manipulated you. You don't even understand what's going on." Jessica took a step forward, her fists clenched. "I understand perfectly. You're the one who doesn't get it. He doesn't want you anymore. You're the one standing in the way." Rachel snapped, slapping Jessica hard across the face. The sound rang through the room. "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she hissed. David stepped between them, trying to calm the situation. "Enough," he shouted, his voice rising. "Both of you need to calm down." Jessica glared at him, tears streaming down her face. "You're a coward," she spat. "You said you loved me, but you're just like everyone else." The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with anger and betrayal. Rachel pushed past David, her voice cold and steady. "We're done," she said. "I want you out of this house tonight." David tried to protest, but Rachel wouldn't listen. "Pack your things and get out," she said, her voice shaking. "You've destroyed this family." Jessica stood frozen, watching as David turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You should go to bed," he said quietly. "We'll talk about this in the morning." But Jessica didn't want to wait. She wanted answers, and she wanted them now. Little did she know, the events of the night were about to spiral even further out of control, leading to a tragedy that would shatter their lives forever. The house was eerily silent after the explosive argument. Rachel locked herself in the bedroom, her mind racing as she tried to process everything. Jessica retreated to her room upstairs, seething with anger and betrayal. Meanwhile, David sat in the living room, nursing a glass of scotch, his thoughts consumed with regret and frustration. Each of them was alone, trapped in their emotions as the events of the evening simmered just beneath the surface. But the silence wouldn't last long. Around midnight, Rachel emerged from the bedroom, her face pale but her eyes steely with determination. She found David in the kitchen, still sipping his drink, without a word. She told him he had to leave that night, saying, "I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." David set his glass down, his face hardening. "I'm not leaving, Rachel. This is my house, too." "Not anymore," Rachel shot back, her voice rising. "You lied to me, betrayed me, and tore our family apart. You think you can just stay here and act like everything's fine? Get out." Slowly, David rose, his voice unnervingly calm. "I'm staying. I've already made enough mistakes tonight. We'll handle this in the morning." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "The morning? Do you think this will just disappear? Do you even realize what you've done?" The argument escalated quickly, with Rachel accusing David of not only betraying her, but also manipulating Jessica, turning her into someone Rachel barely recognized. "She's my daughter," Rachel cried, her voice breaking. "And you poisoned her mind. You destroyed her," David shot back. "Don't put this all on me. You've been so absorbed in your career, you didn't even see what was happening right under your nose." The accusations flew, each word sharper than the last. Hearing the shouting from her room, Jessica quietly crept downstairs, her heart racing. She stopped just outside the kitchen, listening to the argument intensify. David's voice was angrier than she'd ever heard, and Rachel's words were venomous. Then, something shifted. Rachel grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it in front of her defensively. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she said, her voice trembling. "Not after everything you've done." David took a step closer, raising his hands. "Put the knife down, Rachel. You don't want to do this." "Don't tell me what I want," Rachel hissed. "You've lied to me for years, and you've lied to her. You've taken everything from me." Jessica stepped into the room, her eyes wide with panic. "Mom, stop!" she screamed. "You're going to hurt him!" Rachel turned to face Jessica, a mixture of heartbreak and rage in her expression. "You don't get it, do you? He doesn't love you. He's been using you just like he used me." David seized the moment of distraction, lunging toward Rachel to grab the knife. A chaotic struggle broke out, their bodies colliding as Jessica screamed from the doorway. Then, suddenly, it stopped. David staggered back, his hands clutching his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt as he fell to the floor. Rachel stood frozen, the knife still in her trembling hand, her face pale in shock. Jessica ran to David, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. "You killed him!" she screamed at Rachel, her voice raw with emotion. "You killed him!" Rachel dropped the knife, stepping back as if the weight of the situation had finally hit her. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "He came at me. I didn't mean to." Overcome by rage and grief, Jessica grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "My mom killed my stepdad," she told the operator, her voice trembling. "She stabbed him." The call marked the beginning of a nightmare that would reveal the truth about what happened that night and everything leading to it. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars lit up the quiet suburban street as officers filled the Martin home. Neighbors stood on their lawns, whispering to each other as paramedics carried David's lifeless body out on a stretcher. Inside, the kitchen was cordoned off with yellow tape, a grim reminder of the violence just hours earlier. Detective Mia Holloway, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, arrived with her partner, Detective James Keller. They started piecing together the events of the night, beginning with Rachel, who sat on the couch, her hands shaking as she recounted the argument. "It was self-defense," she insisted, her voice trembling. "He came at me. I didn't have a choice." Jessica, however, told a different story. "She killed him because she was jealous," Jessica said, her voice thick with tears. "She couldn't stand that he loved me more than her." Detective Holloway raised her eyebrows at the statement but didn't respond immediately. She carefully noted the conflicting accounts. Rachel, the grieving wife, claiming self-defense, and Jessica, the distraught teenager, accusing her mother of murder. The detectives knew they were dealing with more than just a domestic dispute. It was a web of betrayal and manipulation. As officers processed the scene, they found several key pieces of evidence. The knife, still stained with David's blood, was bagged for forensic analysis. Rachel's arms showed faint bruises consistent with a struggle, and her fingerprints covered the knife. But the most significant evidence were Jessica's accusations and the heated dynamics between the three family members. It was clear that the murder was the result of months, if not years, of tension and secrets. Detective Holloway pulled Jessica aside for a more detailed statement. "Can you tell me what happened tonight, from the beginning?" she asked gently. Jessica nodded, her tears streaming down her face. "I told everyone the truth about me and David," she began. I thought he'd finally leave her for me. But she went crazy. She started yelling at him, and then she grabbed the knife. She just stabbed him." "Why do you think your mother would do that?" Holloway pressed. "Because she's jealous," Jessica said bitterly. "She hated that he loved me more than her." Meanwhile, Rachel was giving her version of events to Detective Keller. She described the argument, explaining how David had lunged at her when she confronted him about the affair. "He was furious," she said. "I grabbed the knife because I was scared he wouldn't stop yelling, and I didn't know what else to do." The detectives were left with two very different accounts and a motive rooted in betrayal. Jessica's story painted Rachel as a jealous wife who had snapped, while Rachel's account suggested she had acted in self-defense against David's aggression. Both narratives seemed plausible, but something about Jessica's behavior raised doubts for Detective Holloway. The detectives dug deeper, obtaining Rachel's phone records, David's emails, and most tellingly, text messages between David and Jessica. What they found complicated the case even further. The texts revealed an inappropriate relationship between David and Jessica. but they also exposed his manipulation. In one message, David wrote, "You're everything to me, but we have to be careful. Your mom can't know. She'd never understand." In another, he warned, "You can't tell anyone. It would ruin everything." The messages painted a picture of a man exploiting Jessica's vulnerability, but also raised questions about Jessica's role in the events of the night. Had she truly been an innocent victim, or was there more to her story than she let on? Detective Holloway knew the case was far from simple. The truth lay somewhere in the tangled mess of lies, obsession, and betrayal, and it was her job to uncover it before the public passed judgment on the Martins. As the investigation continued, Detectives Holloway and Keller began to unravel the complex dynamics that led to David Martin's death. Forensic experts analyzed the knife, and they determined the angle of the stab wound suggested a defensive struggle, supporting Rachel's claim that David had lunged at her. The presence of defensive wounds on David's hands further indicated a physical altercation. The most damning discovery was the bruising on Rachel's arms, indicating that David had grabbed her forcefully during the argument. These findings supported Rachel's self-defense claim, contradicting Jessica's assertion that Rachel had killed David out of jealousy. Meanwhile, text messages retrieved from David's phone revealed the toxic relationship he had fostered with Jessica. In one series of messages, David reassured Jessica that he needed time to figure out how to leave Rachel, even while trying to keep her at a distance. "You have to be patient," one message read. "I can't make any moves until the time is right." In another, sent just days before the murder, he warned Jessica to stop pushing him, suggesting tension between them. The texts painted a chilling picture of manipulation and control. David had exploited Jessica's vulnerability, feeding her infatuation while trying to protect himself. But Jessica's own messages told a different story. The detectives found notes she had written to herself in her phone's notepad app. "He's lying to me," one entry read. "He's never going to leave her." Another said, "I'll make him see that I'm the only one who really loves him." These entries hinted at Jessica's growing frustration with David's empty promises and her deepening obsession. One of the most shocking revelations came from a neighbor who lived across the street. During an interview, the neighbor recalled hearing shouting from the Martin house earlier that evening. "I heard a man's voice, David I think, yelling something like, 'You're ruining everything,'" the neighbor said. "It sounded heated, but I didn't think much of it at the time." The combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and text messages began to form a compelling narrative. David was not the devoted stepfather and husband he had appeared to be. He had manipulated Jessica, likely escalating the confrontation with Rachel that led to his tragic death. While the evidence supported Rachel's self-defense claim, it also raised troubling questions about Jessica's role in the events of that night. Detective Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's version of the story didn't entirely align with the evidence. Why had she been so quick to accuse her mother of murder? Was it possible that Jessica, fueled by her jealousy and betrayal, had played a part in the altercation? Had Rachel truly been the victim, or was there more to this twisted family drama than anyone could have imagined?